The rookie's hand hovered over his cuffs. The older sergeant's eyes did that tired half-squint like he'd smelled this kind of nonsense before, and I, steady as I could pretend to be. Trespassing on his own pier would have been the punchline this morning didn't need. I'm Logan Reed, 20 years in military logistics, the guy who knows how to count boxes in a sandstorm and make miracles out of clipboards, a divorced son who inherited a cedar A-frame on Willowbreak Lake outside Pine Bridge in North Alder County, a place where mist smells like childhood and wet rope and the brass ring of the loons at dawn. And for 2 years that house was a lullaby that never missed a note, until Victoria Hale floated in on a pontoon and tried to rename the song. She arrived wrapped in a smile you could slice with a library card, an $800,000 glass and stone executive residence that looked like a suburban showroom had been airdropped into the pines, and within a week she'd christened the Willowbreak Lakeside Association, not on my deed, not in my life, and declared updated aesthetic standards, which, translated from HOA dialect, meant my aluminum boat was visual. Blight, my grandfather's hand-carved rod holders were non-compliant storage, and my patience was an outstanding balance. The violation notice she taped to my door came on blood-red letterhead, with seals that looked official until you breathed on them, a $500 fine for dock aesthetic non-compliance, 30 days to submit, the kind of paper theater that scares people who haven't lived through the Pentagon's filing cabinets. And I'll admit, for one stupid second, I felt that old shame, the kind that whispers pay it and be quiet. But habits keep veterans breathing. So I went underground the way logistics guys do, down into the courthouse basement where records smell like pencils and winter coats, where the woman who knows everything runs the world with a rubber stamp. And that's where Martha Ellison, 70-something, wrists like willow switches, pulled my property file and muttered the sweetest sentence I'd heard all year. No covenants on this parcel. No restrictions. No HOA. And as if we were swapping gossip in a church kitchen, she added that Victoria Hale had been in here 6 times this month, asking what she could lean and who she could threaten. The association existed all right. 12 members out of 47 homes circling 8 miles of shore, which gave her the legal authority of a duck. Meanwhile, several cabins had recently changed hands to Hale Lakeside Holdings LLC, which, when I followed the breadcrumb trail to short-term listings, revealed what the pretty letterhead hid: unlicensed weekly rentals. City folks bust in to drink and shout and scatter bottle caps where kids used to skip stones. The same person lecturing us about standards, cashing checks off chaos. So I asked one question on Facebook, just a small one. Has anyone else gotten a notice from the Willowbreak Lakeside Association? And my phone started tap dancing across the counter like a fish on a dock. Messages from people who'd never complained about anything in their lives. And suddenly there were stories. An elderly widow shamed about bird feeders, a young couple threatened over mailbox paint, bounced marina checks, whispery calls to code enforcement. And in that surge of voices, a librarian emerged with a binder like a vault. Nora Bennett, retired, quiet, methodical, every incident tabbed and dated. While at the marina, Ralph Kim laid out copies of return payments like a magician revealing the trick, and Agnes Whitlow, 90 and spry as a match, reported headlights and late-night turnover at family rentals. We started a group chat, because if you're going to fight a cartoon villain, you might as well give your team a comic book name. So the Willowbreak Truth Circle was born. And that night the phone rang. A honeyed voice poured through like cough syrup mixed with paint thinner. "Logan, sweetheart," said Victoria. "This road will only get rougher if you take it." And when I said I was only asking neighborly questions, she warned me about cyberbullying laws, the kind of phrase that sounds like a threat when you know the speaker doesn't actually know any laws at all. The next morning, Caleb Ortiz from County Code Enforcement pulled into my gravel drive with the resigned face of a man headed for a root canal, explaining there'd been a report about an abandoned vehicle and dock height deviations. And when we measured and remeasured, and he drank real coffee for the first time that week, he admitted I was his 23rd complaint from the same address in 6 months. And then, carefully, like a carpenter setting a nail, he told me Victoria had offered him a consulting fee to interpret code more creatively, which is a flowery way to say attempted bribe. By dusk, the truth circle slipped into Victoria's emergency meeting. A staging area of beige furniture and edgy smiles where she unveiled pie charts titled Protecting Our Community Investment, slides of non-compliant homes that coincidentally matched anyone who'd told her to pound sand. And when Nora followed her during a bathroom break, democracy at its purest, she overheard a hissed call about payments, about legal pressure, about whatever it takes. And in that breath, the shape of it all clicked. Not standards, not community, just debt and the frantic schemes of someone pretending to be a queen while the castle billowed smoke. I filed a harassment complaint because I know how to fill out forms until the world surrenders. Deputy Samuel Rios met me in late gold sun and said off the record they were tracking the pattern. Nothing criminal yet, but the line was fraying, and that should have been the part where cooler heads cooled. Except bullies rarely choose a soft landing. They pick the cannon and light the fuse. 2 days later, before the second sacred sip of coffee, tires crunched, blue lit my ceiling, and a younger officer trotted out the script about trespass and threats against a female resident. And I invited them in, because you can be brave and gracious at the same time, and Sergeant Dalton Price, whose name tag read like experience, took the chair that had belonged to my grandfather and let me show him the file, the deed, the timeline, the footage of me lifting Agnes's tackle box with 2 hands and a soft back, the public road that was public before any of us were born, the written note from Caleb about a certain consulting fee, and the way the sergeant exhaled told me something fundamental had just shifted. You know that feeling when the chessboard tilts and you realize, with an embarrassing rush of heat, that you've been playing checkers? Well, that's what walked into. Trust agreements and incorporation papers and signatures from a decade that wore bigger glasses, and he explained that in 1987 my grandfather had tucked 4 lakeside properties into the timberline Holdings Trust, and I, thanks to the kind of paperwork miracle only old men and estate attorneys can conjure, owned 60% controlling interest, which meant one of those parcels, the sleek mansion across the cove, the stage where a woman in a robe had pointed at me like a villain. Yes, that house was, through a management company, my tenant's home, and I had been arguing with Victoria Hale, who, without knowing it, had been wiring late rent into an account I never even realized was mine to approve. The lease, Walter said with the satisfaction of a craftsman admiring dovetail joints, contained a symphony of restrictions, peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties, prohibition on unlicensed businesses, community harmony, exactly the lines Victoria had trampled in boots. Who built my dock and my spine said power is measured by restraint. So Walter laid out the playbook he called the ladder. Offer mediation through the county. Document every inch of goodwill. Escalate only when refusal leaves you no road. So no judge could mistake justice for vindictiveness. And I walked out with an envelope labeled notice only if necessary, my hand steady, my breath long. Meanwhile, the Willowbreak Truth Circle grew from a chat into a net. 15 neighbors passing along sightings and receipts. Nora color-coding a binder until it looked like a coral. Drifted past my dock like it had studied stealth on YouTube, hat brim low, plate crystal clear under my LED floods, and by dawn my boat sat half-submerged, the drain plug removed with surgical neatness, oil and gasoline writing their slick signatures on the surface, $2,800 of damage, and a sudden storm inside my chest where anger and grief do as do, like old partners. And when Deputy Rios saw the footage, he didn't sigh. He squared. Logan, this exceeds $1,000. That's felony. And the report went into the system like a bullet into a chamber. But Victoria wasn't just tossing pebbles anymore. She was throwing bricks, because fear makes people try doors they would have sworn were locked, and she began the bribery tour. First to Harold Pierce, a county commissioner, who has survived 12 years of small-town budgets without a single ethics complaint, sliding $5,000 in an envelope across his desk while declaring my cabin an environmental hazard. Then to Carl Dempsey, the zoning inspector who treats building code like scripture, and to a deputy with a smile labeled Community Safety Donation. And that would have been a rumor if Carl hadn't worn a wire during the second meeting. If he hadn't captured the jewelry jingle and the careful counting of bills and the phrase, "We need to relocate the dangerous veteran," and when the district attorney opened a case, When Lydia Monroe at the Pinebridge Gazette started calling with that measured curiosity reporters use when the scent of public money meets private hands, I felt something I didn't expect, a pinch of pity for a person who had confused control with safety and lies with air, quickly swallowed by the obligation to keep the rest of us safe. While we followed the legal path, Colin Archer, a private investigator who looks like he could shoulder a canoe and a refrigerator at once, finished a background report that read like tragic déjà vu, $47,000 in unpaid HOA fees back in Brighton City, lost suits, alleged harassment, weaponized to delay payment to contractors and card companies, and most damning for our lake, 3 clear zoning violations for the short-term rental operation with 0 business licenses, not one, the whole thing a tower built on hope and bluster. Reviews began to shift, bookings slid, neighbors who had been quiet started installing cameras. And it would have been enough to wait for the system to work, but small towns are percussion instruments. They call a meeting, and the gym fills, and the truth hammers. The night of the council session felt like championship week. The Pinebridge High School gym packed with 300 folding chairs. Lydia set up on the baseline, county staff lining the back like rafters. And Victoria swept in a breath late wearing a white suit that declared importance and an expression that admitted the room had already decided otherwise, her city lawyer in tow like expensive perfume. Walter handed me a stack of slides and told me to breathe through my heels, and when I reached the microphone I felt that crackle, that chorus of neighbors, and I began the way old NCOs do. The timeline of complaints traced to one address, the 2:17 a.m. footage, the audio of creative interpretations, and somewhere between the public road map and the bribe transcript the room exhaled. In a single human sound, shock mixing with laughter, as if a magician had walked the trick in reverse. Then I said the part no one saw coming, not even me until last week, that for 3 years, through Harbor and Hearth Management, I had been Victoria Hale's landlord without knowing it, and the reaction detonated, applause and groans and relieved cackles, and when quiet returned, I held up the envelope Walter had labeled for last resorts, and I explained that mediation had been offered and ignored, that law enforcement had been used like a private security firm until it finally pushed back, that neighbors had been harassed and livelihoods threatened, and that as the controlling beneficiary of the Timberline Holdings Trust, I was issuing a 30-day notice to vacate for crisp timing only a nonagenarian can pull off. The county attorney started writing like his pen had caught fire, and Victoria's lawyer tried good faith, which rose into the air like a balloon and popped against the rafters. What happened after felt less like a denouement and more like cleanup after a storm, the kind where everyone shows up in boots and carries branches until you can see the road again. 2 weeks later, a moving truck idled in the dawn outside the mansion windows. Victoria hustled luggage with that tense energy of someone who will never admit a mistake, even while packing it. And there was a forwarding address that smelled temporary and rooms left scuffed like a frat spring, and the criminal case resolved the way small towns prefer, a plea, probation. 200 hours of community service that tasted like poetic justice for someone who tried to monetize the word community. Her attorney probably invoiced a number that could fund a pier. But the point was never money. It was clarity, and the air at Willowbreak cleared as if it had rained for a week, and then turned the color of forgiveness. The Willowbreak Truth Circle didn't dissolve. It evolved into the Willowbreak Advisory Council, which is a fancy way of saying neighbors who mind their own business until someone's business threatens the lake, then show up with muffins and bylaws, who worked with North Alder County Conservation staff to measure water clarity and pull invasives, who helped set up a neighborhood watch that watches crime instead of birdseed, who built a conflict mediation night at the library so small sparks never needed to become headlines. And because you cannot just fight against, you must build toward, we took 3 years of back rent I hadn't realized was ours and seeded the Willowbreak Scholarship Fund for kids headed into environmental science, law, public service, the places where paperwork can be a shield instead of a spear. And that first spring at the fish fry under the pavilion, when a bluegrass trio played Wayfaring Stranger like they'd learned it from the river itself, I watched 2 seniors in borrowed ties accept checks with hands that trembled, and I felt something unclench I didn't know was clenched. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Nora Bennett and I realized we had been finishing each other's sentences for months, that her color tabs and my timelines fit like the grain in a clean joint, that we had both fallen in love with the idea that ordinary people, properly organized, can reroute bullies the way a well-placed boulder reroutes a stream. And we began leaving mugs in each other's kitchens, and I rediscovered my grandfather's shop, the old lathe humming like a purr. The cedar smell that sneaks under your nails and into your dreams, and I started building benches for the public access, teaching kids how to sand with the grain, how to count twice. To scare us now used to measure our shared future, and when the state's environmental agency asked us to present community stewardship best practices, Lydia wrote a headline that made me laugh and cry on the same breath. Pinebridge Lake beats HOA bully with binders and backbone. A few truths grew out of this like reeds around the dock, tough and green and flexible. The first is never sign onto someone's authority without reading the paper it rides in on. The second is that county websites and public records are the flashlight bullies hate most, liens and judgments and ownership. Trails, free for anyone willing to click and learn. The third is that a good camera, purchased legally and mounted lawfully, will tell a story that courts trust when mouths start competing. Has to decide whether to watch them drown or teach them how to float without hurting anyone else. The closure you wanted, the justice you were waiting for. It came, not with sirens but with signatures, not with shouting but with measured sentences and one clean notice. The kind of justice you can tell your kids about without teaching them to spit. And now Willowbreak Lake wakes every morning with a fog that rises like a curtain, the shoreline stitched with neighbors who wave and actually mean it. And I drink coffee on the same dock where I almost got arrested for existing. And I listen to the loons, and sometimes, when the sun hits the water at a slant, I hear my grandfather's laugh and the ripple, soft, approving, the sound of a man who built a life with his hands and left me a map that was written in patience. And still, because the world isn't a fairy tale, and because the next storm is always a rumor away, I keep the binder on a shelf where anyone can reach it. Nora keeps the color printer humming, the advisory council keeps minutes like scripture, and Harold Pierce still answers calls with a voice that says, "In this county, you come clean or you come quiet." And the teenagers who accepted those scholarships now send back photos from labs and classrooms, and we pin them to a corkboard at the marina so the past and future can nod to each other when the wind comes up. That's the story, full stop. The wrong person paid a price scaled to her choices. The right people learned that standing together feels like a muscle you never knew you owned until you use it. The lake is quieter, the night is darker in the good way, and the truth we wrote down will outlast us as long as we keep writing it. Now it's your turn to weigh the thing that won't stop rattling around my head. Was serving that 30-day notice in front of a packed gym an act of community self-defense or a petty flourish I should have avoided? Or should any neighborhood draw the line between reasonable standards and creeping control? When does protecting property values become a costume bully's where to feel tall? Tell me where you land. Argue with me if you must. Share the moment your street got it gloriously right or painfully wrong. Because the next time a paper crown shows up with a gavel and a smile, somebody will need your sentence to steady their hand.